All right, good evening, everybody. I'm so glad that you are with us. Tonight, we are going to start really a continuation of where we were, but I'm calling it a new thing just so it's a little clear to myself and to you guys where we're looking at. It's good to be back, and thank you so much for being with me. I look forward to seeing you all in person at some time. I'm gonna keep saying that just because it gives me hope to never know, one day the email will come from Becca saying, hey, we're going to start up again. Still probably significant weeks to go as we're all still kind of starting the process of vaccinations, which I think most of you are getting yours there. I hope you all get it there. And then eventually we'll get down to people my age. And so I'll be in line. We have some things happening. The college is looking at offering a few more classes on campus in the summer. And while we won't mandate vaccination, it would certainly be a wise idea. And so definitely my wife and I will be attempting to, well, Kim, of course, already has hers, but we will work on making that happen for her. I'm getting a note that it's not reading my, hang on just a quick second. Let me get over here and see if I can make sure I don't lose anybody in the waiting room. There we go. All right, sorry, let's see. They keep changing Zoom on me, so getting kind of a loop for someone. All right, so resume the share. So here we go. That's not round enough for us. Okay, in any case, so for the next 2 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of tail out. We were right here. Hopefully you remember this. We were right here. And what we had seen is what had happened in the roughly 2,000 years of what we consider antiquity. Now, there's obviously tons more. We could spend weeks on end just in Egypt. And maybe sometime we will be able to do that, find an expert who teaches in that area. It's definitely not one of my areas of expertise. But when we kind of cover this, we can see that there's been this foundation of what we consider Western civilization or the world. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at what was going on, obviously, in Asia, which has a robust and deep history back into the same time period, mostly in what we modern day China. And so what I wanted to do this week and next week is give us a high level. I mean, I'm talking to space shuttle level, looking down on the globe, and we say, well, there's North America, and that's really all. You can sort of maybe see the Rocky Mountains. To kind of walk us through what happens in a kind of a geopolitical way amongst all the countries, using that term loosely, nations that we've introduced ourselves to that have worked to this point. Now, along the way, there's a tremendous amount of history. And when you study Western Civ, that history focuses on what happens in Greece and what happens in Italy. And not surprisingly, so as we fast forward to the end of what will be 2 weeks for us, we will find that all of this map, as well as everything to the west of this map, will be under the dominion of Rome. And so you may know your European or Western civilization history. And of course, you know it goes through Greece, Athens particularly, but Greece and Italy, Rome. And so when you get to that spot, you kind of come back to this map consolidated, and it's like, oh, okay, I see how we got here. So there's a lot of other things going on, literary expertise, philosophical development, particularly in Greece, philosophically, art, plays, the birth of theater, the development of theater in Greece and in Rome. And there's other developments that will happen here in the Middle East post-Alexander, which we'll see Alexander in just a moment. But we're not going to go that deep into those areas. And we're going to stay at, again, this high-level view and just sort of get a continuation of an overview of what is happening through antiquity. So again, if you remember where we started the year, we looked at how does historians know anything? How do they make their decisions? How do they consolidate the narrative, we might say? And then we began to notice some, kind of key lessons that we could learn and observe, through antiquity. And then that played itself into kind of following along the journey of Egypt and the Mesopotamian Valley, and ultimately we began to see a lived out expression of that tension that I described to you that we can see worldwide, right? That when you study the human experience, there's an almost ongoing question that the humans are asking, which is, how do we best experience a civic life? What is the best expression of civic life? And there's many ways to deal with that question, obviously. But one of the ways that the question gets asked or expressed, particularly in antiquity, is between whether or not the society is stronger or better if it's a very large setting, or is it better if it's a very small setting? So if you think about it in our own country, geographical space, which North America is a large continent. That's one reason why I've suggested in this past year, it's not entirely fair to compare what's happening, say, in America or North America or the United States with, say, Germany, because the size and scope is completely different, both numerically within population, but also geographically on the scale and scope. There are ways to make those comparisons, but it's not an easy comparison, is the point. And so is living in North America better as a large scale entity? That's what we've done for the 200 years. We've consistently grown larger, right? Which, we know our national story, to where we control a central piece of an entire continent. Or would it be better if, say, Orlando or Central Florida was its own nation to itself? And unless we go, of course not. We have to remind ourselves that a place like Belgium or Luxembourg is roughly the same geographical space as Central Florida would be. And it's its own nation. And we don't scoff at it being its own nation. So is there something going on there? And then, of course, if you look at a nation the size of, say, Luxembourg, then you realize that a small place like Kosovo down in the south of the Balkans, which desires to be its own nation, is far smaller than Luxembourg. Well, we don't have to decide as a group which is better. It really will fall into the experience of the individual, right? But my point is for you to see that is a kind of consistent spin of a pendulum that we humans are wrestling with, which is better for us. Well, we come to our story now, and if you remember, and I should have probably included these slides, the previous maps to this, I showed you how, starting with the Hittites, going through the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, we ended up here, where to use the color of this map, the purple, has grown larger and larger and larger. And of course, with the Babylonians and the Persians, Egypt was swallowed up in that story. So that you have this moment in time in the 550s BC era, where the known world, except for India, most of the rest of the subcontinent, and of course Asia, was under the dominion of one power. So that's the very large, right? That's a very large expression. So what we're going to do today, and I'm actually not sure how far we're going to go. So I've got slides to go a certain distance, and I'm like, I don't know if we'll make it that far. So we're going to see, and then we'll continue it all the way down to where the Roman Empire fell. And if you remember a year ago, or actually 2 years ago now, I suppose, one of my friends, Professor Joshua Robinson, came and did a session with us, might have been 2 sessions, I don't remember exactly, where we looked at the fall or the transition of the Republic to the Empire. Well, he's going to come back this summer and sort of pick that story up and kind of walk us through not too in-depth, but probably a 3 or 4 session study of the Roman Empire itself. So we're not going to go into that this time. And there's a lot of things that are going on alongside the timeline we're going to be talking about tonight that you would know of, and some we've already covered, right? So if you remember, in December, we spent time looking at the development of the Roman Republic and the Greek or the Athenian democracy. Now, we were looking at that from a governing structure point of view, but to do that, we of course spent time kind of gathering their history. So maybe not tonight, well, maybe tonight, we'll kind of skim past those moments, but we won't talk about the governing structure of those times. So let me give you the context of where we find ourselves at this moment when the Persian Empire is the dominant world power, bar none. There's nobody to challenge the Persian Empire at this moment, right? So again, Persia's the dominant empire. Athens is on her journey. Remember, 509 is when we say the democracy was established under Cleisthenes. So for this century before, they'd been working their way through Draco, Solon, Pisistratus into Cleisthenes. While the while, Sparta and Corinth, and to some degree Thebes, but really Sparta and Corinth are the competing city-states in the region to rival Athens economically and militarily, although Sparta is the stronger military society. The Greeks, all the city-states, so not just the three big ones, have spread throughout the Mediterranean region. They're throughout most of the coastline of the Med, including into the Black Sea, and part of the land that the Persians would say was theirs, which is what we're going to get to in a minute. To the west of the Greeks is the Italian peninsula, and to the center west coast is near a series of small mountains, as we've seen before, is the city of Rome. And so Rome is just beginning at this point to begin its journey of a republic. At this stage, it's quite insignificant in the 550s, but it's beginning to get its footing under it. The dominant power in the Italian peninsula is to the north of Rome, and that's the Etruscans. To the north of the Athenians, or the Greeks, lay the groups they would consider the barbarians. So for the Athenians in particular, just north of them is Thebes, and that would have been the end of civilization. It is from the Athenians we get this word barbarian, and I always make sure I tell my students, you have to understand barbarian is in the eye of the beholder, right? So one person's barbarian is somebody else's mom and dad. And they're only the barbarian in the sense that they're outsider. Now, if you remember back on when we looked at that long list of the lessons that we learn about the human species through our study of history and through antiquity in particular, one of the lessons was that there is, again, a constant tension or question of what is an insider or citizen and who is an outsider. And that question is going to always be complex. So our own concerns today and thoughts about immigration, however you may feel about immigration, that question of who can come into this country, who can get access, who works, they're working for a lower fee, is that a good thing or bad thing? All those questions are not new to the human. We may think of them as new, we may talk about them as being a recent problem since maybe the 1980s, but we're fooling ourselves. There's actually a long, long history of this question. So to the north of the Athenians were several people groups, but the one that's going to begin consolidating power is the Macedonians. And they will be if you can remember, I'll show you a map in a second, but if you remember where the Aegean Sea is, to the east of the Greek peninsula, they're to the north of that. They're not dominant yet, but they're coming. And then to the far, far west of the Mediterranean, Phoenicia, which is back on the east coast of the Med, has established a colony roughly in the 900s, so before this moment, and that colony is Carthage. It was Phoenician for new city, basically. And the Carthaginians are really, to some degree, finding themselves as the lone outpost, which means there's no competition. So there are people groups living in North Africa that the Carthaginians will interact with, but largely, to some degree, because of the prior development that occurred for the Phoenicians and the nations around them, that largely militarily, economically, and even in governing structure, the Carthaginians are going to find themselves pretty dominant in the region. And so the far west of the Mediterranean, which will eventually, as we will see, include the Iberian Peninsula. So remember, to the far, far west, if you're looking at a map of the Mediterranean, in fact, let me see if I can bring up a map here. So over here to the far, far west is the Iberian Peninsula. You and I know that's where Spain and Portugal exist today. Then in the middle is the Italian Peninsula, which is where modern day Italy exists. And then to the where the center, I guess center right, is where the Greek Peninsula exists, which again, modern day Greece is there. And then over here is Asia Minor, or modern day Turkey. It's not really a peninsula per se, it kind of sticks out. It's part of Asia, but we've always kind of just called it Asia Minor. So this is the world that we're looking at on this specific map. All these places you see in green are places where the Greeks had already established colonies. Pay attention to the Italian peninsula. We often think of the Italian peninsula as being a peninsula of Italians, and we think of it connected to Rome, but actually the lower third is Greek. The Greeks were there to some degree first and established pretty significant colonies there. So focus your eyes on Asia Minor. You can see the city of Miletus there to the lower part of Asia Minor. And then I'll go back to this other map. If you look at this map, now we're on the eastern part. Here's Asia Minor again, and you can see from the Persian point of view, all of this in purple, which means they think of it as their control. But of course, the Greeks are at that very same time, and really for the century preceding, they've been establishing colonies here. If you remember, the central part of Asia Minor is where the Hittites were, and then here's the upper part of the Euphrates, and this is the Tigris over here. I hope you can see my cursor. So the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates is where Assyria was. So Nineveh was right over here. So the Greeks were outside of the realm with the Hittites, so they would have been trading with the Hittites, and they would have traded with the Assyrians. With the coming of the Babylonians and then the Persians more specifically, now there's going to be a clash. And so that's our next step in our journey. The Greeks in the Greek city-states and the people who live in Asia Minor who are Greek speaking will react to the coming of the Persians by trying to rebel. And there's an attack on a Persian army group in the city of Sardis. And the Greeks of the region were funded, aided by the Athenians. Now, Darius, the emperor of Persia, is able to eventually suppress the rebellion, right? He takes care of it. It's not too hard. I mean, again, you're talking about a superpower, and the Greeks in the region were not united. And upon suppressing it, he begins to investigate. Why did this happen? It's because Darius has not personally been there. And so he's informed of this people group, the Greeks, where he probably would have been told about the Athenians. He was probably told about the Spartans to some degree. And so he wants to make a lesson. Now, at this point, there's no evidence that Darius is somehow thinking of taking over Greece. But this moment of the beginning of the Greco-Persian struggle is a useful one. Again, lessons from antiquity that I point out to my students is that you can visualize and see to some degree, 6,500 year, but an ongoing tension between, it's not really fair to say East and West, but certainly the West, and we're talking about Western civilization and civilization of Europe, which is the dominant, as I've explained to you, the dominant civilization in the world today. And I guess you could say everybody else, not West, right? So, and it's going to be a repetitive cycle that we see. And I think it's dangerous to draw too strict of a line between this moment and our own moment starting in 2001, or really starting in the 1990s, 1980s. But I think there is a connection. And so if you were ever interested in studying kind of what's happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and what that does and how that plays out in modern Middle East, there is a line to be drawn about kind of this clash. And so one of the things historians love to do is the what if, right? So we build these counterfactuals, or we study an ahistorical moment. We talk about, well, what would the world have been like? And this is one of those key moments. There's several of these, and you probably can think of them, some that you might be interested in. But this is one of the biggies, because if Persia conquers the Greeks, then a tremendous amount of Western civilization shifts. I'm not saying it's worse necessarily, but it is vastly, vastly different in the story. So Darius, again, does not seem to plan a takeover of Greece. He's not seemingly prepared to try to expand Persia's control, direct control. But he does want to send a message to people he would have considered barbarians, right? So he's going to consider Athens the barbarians, that, you know, don't mess with us. And so the way he's going to do it is he's going to invade. Now, let me stop for a second and just make the point that, again, high level observation from this point through at least the end of these 2 days, I want you to note how many of these conflicts happen in threes. I don't know that there's a pattern there worth calling out, a specific pattern, but many of the events we're going to talk about have three parts. And the Greco-Persian War is one of those. And so part one is here in the very famous Battle of Marathon. Now, you may not have ever heard of the Battle of Marathon, but if you've ever watched the Olympics or ever had any interest in the sport of running, you know the word marathon, which, as you should know, is a 26.2-mile run. I can't imagine ever doing that myself, but maybe some of you have done that. But we know people love to do that. Running is a great endeavor and health, way to build good health. And it comes from this moment in time where the Athenians, who at that time were led by Milades, were trying desperately to get anybody to help. Now, remind yourself, I've told you this a couple of times, you can't think of the Greeks as united. They're not the Greeks. There's the Athenians and the Corinthians and the Thebians and the Spartans, of course. And there's Messenes and Olympians and a whole bunch of other people who saw themselves as residents and natives, citizens of they wouldn't have used the term nation, but an independent entity that had no allegiance to anybody else. And so the Athenians recognized, we can't fight the Persians by ourselves. So we're going to have to unite the Greeks, and they'll really spend the next 30 years trying to pull this off. In this moment, it will be very unsuccessful because the other Greek cities are like, yeah, we did not help the Asia Minor people start this conflict with Persia, so we're not getting involved. And there's a very famous runner whose name was Phidippides, who was sent by the Athenian government to run to Sparta, which is literally 140 something miles away, to ask for help. They reject it, say, nope, it's a holy week. We just don't, we're not getting involved. I think there was probably some truth that it was a religious moment for the Spartans, but also, yeah, we don't want to get in that fight. We're not interested. So he runs back to Athens and gets there in time to march off to the war, to the battle. Marathon, it's kind of hard to see on these maps, but Marathon is right down here on the kind of the eastern coast of the little outcropping of Attica, where you see Athens. And so over here, you can sort of see it on the coast. Again, not a great map, but this is, you know, the Aegean Sea, basically. There's Marathon, the city, and the Greeks met them on the coast. So Phidippides, the dude who was the runner, he's with the army. Now, they're outnumbered 3-1. It's not good. So the Greeks do two things that was to their advantage. One, as you can sort of see in this lower map here, is they attacked the Persians really before they were fully off their ships. I mean, they are off their ships, but they don't allow the larger Persian army to array itself in battle. The Greeks kind of rush in and hit them at the beach. It's sort of the reverse of what the Americans experienced at D-Day. You know, it's hard to make a beach landing. So the Germans, you know, had to attack, and they did in some spots like Omaha Beach. Here, the Greeks are going to be the attackers, really carrying the initiative at the Persians. And so they caught them on the beach, which helped. And then, as you can see from these blue pictures here, they basically weakened their center so they could wrap around and hit at the flanks. It really caught the Persians off guard. And ultimately, the day will go to the Athenians. The Persians will retreat, get back on their boats, and kind of sail away. Remember, they weren't coming to land in order to take over. They weren't trying to occupy Athens. They really just wanted to show up and probably smack some Athenians around, maybe burn something down, demand tribute financially, and then leave. Well, this is a real surprise for them. They did have a larger navy, the Persians. And so there was a threat of the Persians sending part of their fleet around to Athens. Again, this map's way too small, but if you see this little dotted line here, that's kind of basically what that's showing, is that the Persians had sent part of their fleet around. So our boy Phidippides runs the 26 miles back from Marathon to Athens. Remember, he's run 140 something miles from Athens to Sparta, and then he ran back a few days later, got back in time to march off to the battlefield, fights in the battle. When the war's it's over, Milades sends him back, says, go back to Athens. And he runs back to Athens, with his dying breath, because he's pretty exhausted, he says, rejoice, we conquer. And future Greeks will honor that moment by including a 26-mile run in their Olympic games that they had at those times. And then in the modern age, it will obviously be incorporated in. Well, this moment was a real surprise for the Persians, and they're going to have to think about what they're going to do with it. So meanwhile, at the exact same time, over in Italy, the Romans are really starting to get their footing. And so for roughly a 50-year window, they're going to be consolidating control right in the center of the Italian peninsula. To do it, they're going to have to deal with, one, the Etruscans, which are still around, and then also the Latin League, or the peoples around them in city-states to some degree, tribal peoples, spoke Latin. That's where we get it from. The Romans were not speaking Latin we always think of Rome and Latin together, but really they're two separate groups that merged together. With a 10-year war diplomatic struggle, the Romans will ultimately be able to consolidate the city and tribal peoples nearest to the city of Rome and create what was known as the Latin League. And with them, they'll then battle the tribes, the Quae and the Volsci, who are roughly, they're right in that same basic area that, Italy, you can think of Italy as being a version of Florida, except they have a mountain in the middle, right? So the Apennine Mountains are roughly going north and south. In the middle, our American soldiers in World War II found out how much of a struggle it was to fight that battle. That's why the city-states of Italy, if you look at it and think of it in the Renaissance, which we had talked about it, they're either on one side or the other. There are some beautiful places in the center, but Florence and those places are all on the west coast with Rome, and then Venice are on the other coast in the process because of the mountains. And so the Latin League and the Romans will successfully control central Italy at that point. Carthage at the same time is, as I said to you a moment ago, and so here's how you can see a map of, in case you weren't able to really visualize where we were talking about. Here's Carthage. They're on the tip of what would be modern day Tunisia, right? So Carthage is really finding themselves alone, and they're able to expand their own colonies, mostly to the islands. So here you can see Sicily, where's my thing? There's Sicily, there's Sardinia, Corsica to the north up here. And they do eventually get to the kind of the tip of the Iberian Peninsula. They're not really involved initially there, and their focus is trade. And because there's nobody else to compete with them, they become, very wealthy and powerful as they grow and develop in that region. So it's kind of our workforce. Again, here you can see Rome, where you can see it sits here, and the Etruscans are the larger, more dominant power, and here the Latins are kind of in this, again, this sort of central area. And again, a good reminder, below them, the bottom third of the peninsula is Greek. All right. I wish I was there with you in person. I could see your face, make sure I haven't lost you. I don't like to lose people, but kind of moving our way forward. So back in Greece, while this is going on, both for the Romans and the Carthaginians, Darius dies back over in Susa, which is the capital of Persia. His son is a man named Xerxes. And you may know Xerxes. He's the central protagonist in the story of Esther in the Bible. And he's certainly the central protagonist of the Greco-Persian War. He is very involved in the storylines of the rebuilding of the Jewish temple for the Jewish people. If you know your Bible, the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, their histories, writings, he's involved in that story there. Xerxes wants retribution. for the embarrassment to his father and to the nation. And this time, I think it is fair that Xerxes is thinking of, we'll just color that part of the world ours. So they're now going to press on and make a full-scale invasion. You know, with ancient sources, sometimes with the numbers, modern historians aren't certain that you can really reconcile what we read versus what we think is normal. I personally think sometimes we should rely on the ancient sources, but it is fair that sometimes the numbers seem a little large. So we're not totally sure. Herodotus is the main recorder of the story from the Greco-Persian experience. And of course, being Greek, he's slanted in his viewpoint, right? But we believe that Xerxes did have 150,000 troops, maybe closer to 200,000. He certainly had a very large navy of over 600, maybe 800 ships, which is a massive, massive fleet. The Athenians and the Greeks are no more united in that time period. The new leader in Athens is a man named Themistocles. Themistocles, like Miletus before him, is like, hey, we kind of need to get together. And nobody's interested. Now, this time, the Spartans are more aware of the danger. Now, Sparta is led by two kings at once, but the more famous, well-known, you probably know this person, leader of Sparta is a man named Leonidas. Now, Leonidas agrees with Themistocles, if we don't work together, we're not going to make it. And so he wants to join in and sort of have Sparta take the lead. But once again, the Spartan kind of government and religious leadership will not allow that to happen. So very famously, Leonidas leads his personal bodyguard of 300 soldiers off. The main army of Sparta does not get involved. They're joined by some very small numbers of troops from some of the other city-states, and they eventually march to the north of what would be considered Greece at the time. And you can see it here on the map, this area here, to Thermopylae. And it's at Thermopylae, the very famous story of the 300 Spartan soldiers, you know, fighting to their death takes place. Again, there are more than 300 Greeks there fighting. Towards the end, they're betrayed. The Persians are alerted to a pass around the hot gates, around the mountain position that Leonidas had taken up. And so they're betrayed by a Greek, which wasn't unusual. Actually, in the Persian army fighting against, at this moment, there were Greeks who were either from the Asia Minor side or either from the northern side, north of Attica and the lower part of Greece, because they're like, okay, whose side are we going to get in on? We might as well get on with the winners, and Persia is going to be the winners. So after Thermopylae, Xerxes believes he's got it, and he's going to march further south, and he will destroy the city of Athens in September of 480. The citizens had all been evacuated to a small island in the bay area around Athens. Again, I don't know if you can see it very well, but here's Athens on what's called Attica, so the lower part of the Greek peninsula. Here's Corinth on the kind of bridge between Attica and this larger area called the Peloponnese, right? And down here is Sparta, right? So again, I hope you can see my cursor moving. So here's Sparta. So Sparta, Corinth, and Athens, again, they kind of make up this trifecta of the most important Greek city-states generally. So there's a little tiny island right here in this bay called Salamis, and the Athenians owned it and they evacuated to that spot. Now, it was a temporary solution because the Persians are coming, right? So Xerxes sees his moment that if he can destroy the Greek navy, and united, the Greek navy had maybe 300 ships. So it's a 2-to-1 battle. If he can destroy them, then obviously he wins. And there'll be no real contest. Sparta would not be able to outlast on her own in a battle against the larger Persian army. Corinth would have given in. It would have been an easy victory at that point. Now, there's some suggestion that Themistocles uses what happens at Thermopylae with the spy and the turncoat and the betrayal to his advantage. We're not certain this happened, but there's some suggestion that Themistocles sent a spy to Xerxes to tell him that the Greek navy was both splitting up around Salamis and disunified. And to the point that if the Persian navy would surround Salamis on both sides, you could crush them. It'll be over big. Well, that whether there was that or just Xerxes decided on his own to try to make that happen, when the Persians roll in, as you can see from this map, their numbers, just like with Thermopylae, will not be successfully be utilized because it's a very close encounter, and the Greeks were in no way breaking apart. By sending part of his fleet away, Xerxes and the naval leaders at the time made it far worse for themselves. The Greeks were ready, and there were Spartan soldiers and warriors, the pretty much full Spartan army as Marines, basically on the boats. And of course, you may know, and I should have had a picture for you of the boat of that day, was not like we think of when we think of navies with guns and weapons to fire at each other from some distance apart. The whole point was largely to get close enough to either ram with the head of your boat or get close enough to ram or sideswipe so that your soldiers could leap on. Well, the Persian sailors were going to be no match for Spartan warriors, and it becomes a massive debacle for the Persians. Again, we're always kind of cautious with some of the numbers because of our sources and how we kind of track our sourcing. But in general, we were pretty confident the Persians lost roughly half of their navy in this one battle. Now, that doesn't end the war, but it was a massive setback. And it was a big enough setback that Xerxes, for one reason or another, left. So he was there personally after the Battle of Salamis. He leaves and just goes back to Persia. Persia is not in some way destroyed. The Athenians aren't going to invade Persia. He will leave what would still be a significantly large army. Unfortunately for Xerxes and the Persians, because of the victory at Salamis, and perhaps because of the inspiration of the sacrifice by those at Thermopylae, many city-states will unite behind kind of an Athenian Spartan leadership, and a large Greek army, roughly the same size as of the remainder of the Persian army, will meet in a battle at a place called Plataea. And that happens in August of that year. So the invasion is really a 2-year window, year and a half window. That starts off with a pretty significant victory for the Persians at a cost. But then the Athenians are able, and the Spartans are able to rally everybody to their cause. Again, this is not in the story. This is just part 2 of the Greco-Persian conflict, but Athens and the Greeks are saved. And again, this is really where you do the what if. What if they had not united? What if they had not had the victory at Salamis? And then what happens to world history? And there's a whole road we could go down. We won't, but it's fascinating to kind of do that thought exercise of what is lost if the Persians dominate. Again, it's not like, oh, everything would be terrible. It just means you would have lost something. You might have gained some things from Persia that would have been better for Western civilization, maybe world civilization. But regardless, we didn't happen that way. Now, because they had won, we would think that they would be friends. But again, another lesson from history is that just because 2 groups of people will unite against a common enemy does not mean they're going to be friends later. And to some degree, we see an echo of what happens to the Greeks in what happens to us after World War II. Right? So we have united nations fighting against evil Germany and Japan, right? And then when it's all over, we should have world peace, right? But of course we don't, because 2 of the leaders, the USA and the USSR, they go at it with each other in a thing we call the Cold War, which, as you know, was not actually no war. Other people fought, and a lot of soldiers, Russians and Americans, and a lot of other people fought and died in that window of time from post-World War II through 1989, if we want to use that date as the window. So similarly here, the Athenians want to create kind of a NATO experience. I'm going to show you a map, then I'll come back. So here, they want to try to unite all the city-states. And again, in their minds, really the lower city-states, But they, again, remember they've got all these colonies over here. And so not including the Macedonians, we don't deal with the barbarians, but in these lower areas, we should unite, the Athenians said, to deal with the Persian threat, which still existed. Again, Persia's just had a setback. They weren't defeated. They weren't destroyed in some way. Well, to the Corinthians, to the Spartans, and to some degree maybe the Thebians, Thebes is kind of city number 4, you know, they didn't like this. Well, they didn't like the way it worked out. Initially, everybody's cool. Yay, we say we didn't die to Persia. We're all friends. Let's work together. But before long, from their point of view, Athens went from being kind of a liberating hero to a domineering dictator. And so they don't like it. And this begins to show up with conflicts between Corinth and Sparta and Athens, mostly between Sparta and Athens. And even though there's some attempts at diplomacy, it doesn't lock in. So this Athenian-Spartan tension will explode into the Peloponnesian War, which happens in 3 parts. Again, we're going to see this repetitively. Here's the dates for them for you. This one, we don't have to go quite as deep on. One, because even though it happens in 3 parts, there's a very similar, there's kind of a larger overview that just kind of is easier to grasp. And that is this. The Athenians, going into the main part of the Greco-Persian conflict, so the part with Xerxes, had clearly become the dominant naval power. Now, this actually started pre-Xerxes, pre-Themistocles, because the Athenians, even as far back as Draco, but even more so under Solon and Pisistratus, had begun to really develop economic trade. They were the principal traders of the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Carthage was in the west, then they were in the east, and their trade ships were everywhere. And for Athens in particular, they took pains to develop the olive oil industry and eventually a wine industry. And they were, shipping in food in order to put the focus of their land and the growth of their agricultural business into olive oils and wines. And so that was their trade. So because they had a trading background, from the 650s, 550 period of time, clearly they were naval. And of course, Sparta, you've seen the movies, I'm sure, this is Sparta. Right? Sparta is the military, the land battle. So what you get in this struggle of the Peloponnesian War is a wonderful experience. Who wins the battle between, an elephant and a shark, or a lion and a shark? Well, they're not, in each other's battlefield, or maybe more closely an alligator and a lion, right? Well, the alligator gets up on the land, probably the lion. The lion tries to get into the water, probably the alligator. So, who's going to win this battle? And if you like Athens, it's a sad story, because eventually their pride will get to them and they will overreach in arrogance. Again, a very common theme when you look through human history of successful, victorious nations. Some would accuse Xerxes of that of very, very much overreaching when he didn't need to. There was going to be no threat of the Athenians or the Greeks somehow invading the Persian Empire. But regardless, the Athenians overreach, and in part 2 of the story, they attempt, and you can see it on the map there, to go all the way to Sicily. Now remember, lower part of the boot and most of Sicily was colonized by Greek peoples. So these were not uninterested bystanders. And Syracuse was the dominant city-state of Sicily. In fact, Syracuse had previously, to this point, really kind of been at war with the Carthaginians over who would dominate on Sicily. And Sicily was in control of the eastern half of their island. Syracuse was in control of the eastern half of Sicily. And so they were, to some degree, aiding the Spartans, though they weren't full-fledged participants. They didn't like Athens acting like they were the dominant power, because from Syracuse's point of view, they were certainly the equal of Athens. And the Athenians attack Syracuse. It doesn't go well. They get kind of stuck in a situation that's not victorious, sort of like us in Vietnam, I guess. sort of like the Russians in Afghanistan. You just get stuck in this slog you can't get out of. And in the meantime, Sparta gets a new leader, a man named Lysander, and he, perhaps not too, oh wow, but nonetheless, he's like, we need to build a navy. If we can build a navy, and again, what's the battle of navies is by attacking and soldiers on the ships. Lysander correctly surmises we'll win. If we can just get a navy and get enough soldiers on ships, we'll be able to defeat the Athenians in battle. And they do, and this one I have a hard time, but Agios Batami, there we go, has that, not too bad. I'm sure I butchered it, but there's not too bad. 405 BC. So at the very tail end of the three parts, of part 3, the Spartans will destroy the Athenian navy, and then that's it. And Athens surrenders, and basically this is the moment when power in Greece moves north. Now we would imagine that the Spartans would to some degree play the role that the Athenians had tried to play. But if you know your Spartan history well enough, that's not Sparta's game. They're not big, they're not rich, they don't have a large population, they had very tight population controls. So they really were not in a position, having won the Peloponnesian War, to affect, themselves onto the rest of the story. This is actually the moment where power will shift north to Thebes, and through Thebes, Macedonia. So before we go there, let's kind of say what else is going on, so the early 500s. So with the Latin League, while this war is kind of happening, and at the very end of the war between the Spartans and the Athenians, the Romans will successfully destroy or break the power of the Etruscans. The Etruscans' main city of Veii was captured and conquered and destroyed by the Romans. That doesn't mean the Romans are without, being threatened, because as you can see immediately after that, well, 6 years after that, the Gauls roll in from the north. So Gauls are modern day France, basically. They're part of a Celtic peoples, and there's large debate amongst some historians as to Gaul, Celtic, who's where. But largely, they're a tribal group in modern day France. And with the Etruscans being kind of broken, it opened the door for the Gauls to say, oh, let's go down here and see what happens. And they're able to successfully attack Rome, just defeat Rome in battle, and actually sack the city. Now, they don't burn the city down, but they do have 2 or 3 days of attacking the city. And that moment will be the last time the Roman city, the city of Rome, is actually sacked or successfully attacked for 800 years, or 700 and something years, to 410 AD. So Rome got a lesson in arrogance after defeating the Etruscans, that they realized we have to control things. They would really kind of work to build up their defenses in the north, because in the Roman mind, the Gauls will become the scary bad guys. It's the boogeyman of stories Roman parents would tell their children. They'll be, be good or else kind of thing. I hope you didn't do that with your kids. We do it with my kids, but some people do, right? You tell your kids to be good or the boogeyman's going to get you, kind of a thing. And the boogeyman for the Roman children were the Gauls. And so they'll defend against the Gauls, and they'll be a threat till Caesar destroys them in the 1st century. So roughly 300 something years. As mentioned though, Athens' retraction in power opens a power vacuum to which Thebes steps in. Sparta is not really able to manage it. You might say, what about Corinth? Well, Corinth was also a trading city like Athens. And even though an important city, and you may know it again from your reading of the Bible, if you have read the New Testament, that there's 2 very large letters from the Apostle Paul, the missionary, to the city of Corinth, the church in Corinth. And he writes 2 big letters, actually wrote probably 3 or 4 to them. We only have 2 that are in the Bible. The Corinthians never were strong enough economically to take on Athens, or strong enough militarily to take on Sparta. So they're kind of in the middle, and to some degree, they often became the hinge upon which the battles took place. And in 395, there was the Corinthian War, which really is a battle between Thebes and Sparta, which will then open up into the Theban-Spartan Wars of the next decade, in which after the Battle of Lucretia, the Thebians will take over. So Thebes has their moment in the spotlight, it won't last very long. Here's a large scale map of where we are at this moment, all the different people groups. So again, up here's old modern day France, of course. So this is where Gaul is. Over here's the Iberians. The Phoenicians, that's kind of misleading because really Phoenicians, think of that as the Carthaginians controlling all this. And then here we are again, close up of Greece. And again, Persia is still with us. So they're still kind of dominant. But to the north of the Greeks, so here on this little inset of the map, you can see up here is Macedonia, and that Macedonian peoples are going to start getting involved in our story. The Macedonians were the tribal peoples between the northern Balkan tribes, so on up the Danube. The Macedonians saw those people as barbarians, and they considered themselves part of Greece. In fact, if you go back to this map, you can see Mount Olympus, right? So remember, down here is the sacred triangle between Athens and Olympia itself, the city, and then Delphi, which is like right, it's not on the map, but it's right here between these, that A and that B. But Mount Olympus is obviously very important in the Greek pantheon of the gods, which we saw that when we did the religious study. Macedonians said, hey, we worship those guys too, right? So we're kind of in that story of kind of worshiping those guys. So the Macedonians now get involved at the very moment Thebes is really having a coming up party and thinking, okay, I'm going to control things. The Macedonians get a new leader in Philip II, young man, 23. The decade before, while his father was on the throne, there had been some battles between the Macedonians and the Thebians, and Philip had been a hostage post-war, which happened a lot. While he was there, he's going to get a real lesson. And he's going to some degree, recognize, wow, we are backward. It's somewhat similar to what happens with Tsar Peter the Great. Now, he's not a hostage, but he goes on a very famous tour in the 1600s and eventually goes to Versailles, visits the French crown, and recognizes, wow, these Westerners are so much more advanced than us. And Peter and then Tsar Catherine after him will basically cast their gaze of Russia to Europe. Previous to that, the Russians never thought of themselves as European or never really were interested in what was going on in Europe. But now, at that moment, they'll recognize, one, we are way behind developmentally in all levels behind these people, and we want to catch up. So we're going to become them. Well, the Macedonians do the same thing. Philip kind of walks away from this, recognize that philosophically, governmentally, and militarily, and the Macedonians would have thought of themselves as the equal of the Spartans, and Philip's like, yeah, no, we're not. And so he goes back, and when he's released and he becomes the king, one of the very first things he does is a massive reform effort. He doubles the size of the infantry, six-fold the size of the cavalry, really makes an elite cavalry fighting force at a time when most armies did not have cavalry at all, or if they did, they were only scouting units. They kind of just roamed the outer part of the battlefield. And Philip's going to create a real warring a cavalry that will be involved in a direct attack on infantry units, which was simply not done by anybody else. And he'll create kind of a professional soldiery. He'll create a corps of engineers concept to develop siege weaponry and to figure out best ways to cross rivers or to defeat an enemy behind a river as opposed to just charging on ahead. He will restructure and redevelop the Greek phalanx, which was the principal way of them fighting, which the Spartans had somewhat made famous. He introduces a longer weapon, so 18 feet long. I mean, that's massively, I don't know how he held it in place, but basically the Greek phalanx becomes this very deep weapon of attack under the Macedonians. And with this, he's going to begin to set out to recapture and reform what we call Greece today, to include Macedonia. He will deal with the northern Greek tribes, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, they can't get really involved. And then at the Battle of Chernea, he destroys and defeats Thebes, basically. So 338, Philip decides it's time for round 3 with the Persians. And what he's going to do is create another united Greek forum that he called the League of Corinth to go after Persia. Except in 336, he's assassinated. All the evidence points to Persia being involved in this. It's possible that they didn't, because he was killed by members of his own Macedonian protection force, but more than likely they were bought off. Well, then this seemingly makes Macedonia ripe for turmoil because his son Alexander is only 20. But of course, as you know, this becomes Alexander the Great, and he's going to take the weaponry that Philip devised and apply it to work. He's already been involved in the battles of his father when he was 17, 18, and 19. So he's already got 2 or 3 years of military training under him. He was educated by Aristotle. Remember, Philip wants to basically make Macedonian Greek. So he found the best educated person, a man who'd been trained by Plato, and brought him to Macedonia. Said, hey, you're gonna teach my son and some of the other children of the elite aristocracy. So Alexander is not some backwoods country hick. He knows what he's doing, and he's ready to take over and lead. And he will begin to structure what he would consider a revenge plan. Now, my take on the Alexandrian invasion of Persia, casting it as part 3, let me show you a map and we'll come back to this. You know, the part 3 of the Greco-Persian War, not every historian would call it that way. Certainly there's been a long time between Xerxes' invasion and the Alexandrian invasion. And again, to the Athenians and the Spartans, Alexander and the Macedonians, they're not even Greek. But if you work with me, I think it fits that it is kind of a part 3, because to this moment, and we see this with Philip's plan, Persia is still the dominant power. This map doesn't have colors on it, but you can still basically see where Philip goes is all the old Persian Empire still was effective and functioning. All of Asia Minor, all down the Mediterranean coastline, all of Egypt, all of old Babylon, old Assyria, and of course, all of Persia under, Persian control, so under Susa, modern day Iran. And then to some degree, the Persians had inklings and involvements over into the edges of what we would call India today. Well, so Alexander is to some degree responding to this Persian threat, which I think fits as part 3. Let me just give you this last little bit here, and then we'll use this as a break point. I remember I told you I wasn't sure how far I would get, so we'll kind of go the rest of the journey. I may have to pick up the pace a little bit or make it a 3-part story. Alexander wants to leave, and he knows he's going to be gone for a while. He's going to be a long campaign, assuming that he doesn't get defeated. So he wants to make sure things are secure at home. So to do that, he destroys and conquers the northern tribes that they would have considered barbarian north of Macedonia, so up to the Danube. Then he goes south, and to kind of make a point, he destroys the city of Thebes and burns it to the ground. So kind of sending a message, hey, all y'all, even after I leave and take the Macedonian Greek army away, just realize, don't mess with me. And then he begins his invasion in Persia. And he does it by crossing the Hellespont into Asia Minor. And he fights his first major battle. I'm bringing this map up again, and we'll kind of stop right here at the Granicus River, right there. This was really Persia's probably best moment to stop Alexander, because they were not lacking in confidence. Once the Persians lose the Battle of Granicus River, to some degree, and I keep trying to use allusions that will help us, and I'm so tying it back to World War II, many of us are familiar. Once the Germans roll out the Blitzkrieg in Poland, and then later in Denmark and up in Norway, to some degree, what happens in France and the Low Countries, and even in the first part of the campaign against Russia, is psychological. Their army wasn't necessarily with better equipment, certainly not against France. France had the better tanks. But psychologically, there was a fear factor. And I think Alexander kind of gets this momentum on his side. Granicus River was the moment when the Greeks could have possibly stopped him, and they came really close. Another one of the what ifs. Alexander, like most people who would be in war, has near-death experiences. And this happened, happened to Robert E. Lee. What if, Stonewall Jackson did die? What if he didn't die? And Alexander had a really brief moment, but he survives it. And by winning the Battle of Granicus River, the rest of the Persian Empire now was open to him. So at this moment where we will stop for the night, with Alexander basically returning the East-West battle with taking the attack to the east, takes his gaze away from, and you can see it here in the map, the Italian peninsula, where the Romans are beginning to really firm up. Now, I'm sure the Macedonians somewhat knew about the Romans, but they weren't interested. They would have looked at the Romans also as somewhat barbaric. And they probably had very little knowledge of the Carthaginians, although to some degree, Carthage at this point is economically the equal of the united Greek, city-states. So whether they could have competed militarily. So you've kind of got, Persia, they're the big superpower, but they're aging and dying. Here comes Alexander the Great with his retribution campaign, while there's a bubbling up in Rome and the Carthaginians. And so you've kind of got these major powers in this 300 windows. We head to the 200s that are kind of on the map, kind of working their way around. All right, I'll stop there, and we will look at the latter part, not in great depth. Alexander's campaign could be probably 3 or 4 sessions all to itself. We'll do a real quick glance over the rest of Alexander's campaign, and then we'll keep going, because I've kind of already hinted, some of you may already know, with Rome rising, they're going to run headlong in their area of the woods with Carthage. So we'll see that. We'll roll it out together. Thank you again, as always, for being with me. I look forward to seeing you next Thursday when we'll kind of wrap up the story. All right. Hope you guys have a wonderful night. We'll stop sharing and stop the recording.